What if I could prove to you that poverty is literal violence? Would you be interested in learning how the human organism is physically changed by the stressors of poverty? If I can prove that poverty forces upon those within it a biological state of disrepair, would you be willing to hear it and grieve the loss of old paradigms regarding meritocracy? Would this alter your thoughts on how to improve society? This essay intends to do this. Through reason, statistics, science, and the research of experts, I want to prove that poverty goes hand in hand with polyvagal science, which goes hand in hand with traumatology, which goes hand in hand with epigenetics, and why all of this is so pertinent to the future of humanity, and why it is vital to understand it as fully as we can. As a disclaimer, this is specifically about the United States because that's what I know. However, this may be applicable to any Western colonized civilization. I'll also point out that this essay will zigzag between philosophy, economics, and biology. So there will be times it seems I'm leaving the realm of epigenetics, but I will return to the biological effects of anything that I mention. I need to start with some groundwork. Much of it you may already know, but please bear with me. This essay must begin in a way that is sure that the listeners are on the same page. There will also be a lot of information presented in a short amount of time, so feel free to pause and think or to replay certain parts. We need to define terms beforehand. Poverty, a state of deprivation caused by a lack of money. Capitalism, an economic system primarily based on the idea of ownership and the acquisition of captive markets by commodifying the needs of every individual into a product or service exchanged for money. Behavioral violence, a harmful act of an individual against another living being. Structural violence, harmful acts against masses of living beings as a result of systemic policies and cultural ideologies. Nurture, an act of safekeeping and a giving of physical or emotional nourishment to another living being or beings. These are needed definitions because many aspects of poverty, in terms of how it harms the biological organism, is outright violence, and other aspects are a society's failure to nurture the people within it. Let's first ask a question. Is it reasonable to want a safe home to share with your family, access to therapy, health care, and enough nutritious foods each day? If our answer is yes, it is reasonable to want this in a civilized society. There are some structural issues we must address. Let's start with housing. In our economic climate, almost everyone who wants to own a home must take out a loan to do so, meaning families are often at the mercy of lenders to own a home. Thus, loan denial results in these families needing to rent where it is more close to affordable for them to do so. As a result of redlining by the Homeowners Loan Corporation, cheaper housing options are in areas nearest to industrial toxins. So, if everyone who is denied a loan has to settle for the redlined areas, there must exist a regional segregation of class. There are people who can afford to buy or can get a loan to live in a better area, and those who cannot now all live in the less desirable areas. In the US, people of color are 2.7 times more likely to be denied home loans according to Reveal as of 2018, meaning this segregation of the property owning class and the impoverished is not only classist segregation, but racist as well. There are low-income housing assistance programs in the US. However, if one rises above the poverty line, they no longer get that assistance, meaning they cannot responsibly accept promotions or get higher paying jobs unless the pay increase matches or exceeds the value they would lose in government assistance. One massive problem with forcing impoverished people to live in the same area is the public school system is funded by property tax. This means that any school within walking distance of redlined neighborhoods is essentially guaranteed to be underfunded. When public schools are underfunded, the programs that are cut are often things like dance, arts, after-school clubs, music, theater, etc. These programs considered non-essential, we now know from the work of Stephen Porges, Benjamin Fry, Bessel, van der Kolk, and others, are parasympathetic nervous system regulators. This is where we shift from talking about this as forced economic misfortune to talking about this issue as systemic violence to the human organism, why poverty and PTSD go hand in hand. Things you need to know going forward in a nutshell. The entire human organism operates from either the stress response or the rest response, and the operation of one shuts down the other. This is polyvagal theory. I suggest the work of Stephen Porges if you wish to learn more about this. Trauma is not an event, it is a change inside the body as a result of intense stress. When the body adapts to an experience in such a way that your nervous system lives more in its stress response and less often in its rest response, that is trauma, because it altered the functionality of your body to navigate the world more so as prey in persistent search for nearby threats. To learn more about trauma, I suggest the works of Bessel, van der Kolk, and Gabor. Epigenetics is the body's attempt to alter its formation and function as a result of its environment, so that it is more fit to survive present and recurring circumstances. This alteration of what genes to use and develop is stored in the DNA that will be passed down. To learn more about how the epigenetics of trauma are passed down, I suggest the works of Mark Wolin and Luann Brizendine. Nervous system dysregulation is when your body cannot decide if it should operate from a feeling of safety or a feeling of threat. To learn more, I suggest the work of Benjamin Fry, especially The Invisible Lion. Attachment wounds are emotional bonding traumas between an infant or toddler and their parents. Since, as infants, we are incapable of meeting our needs, the formation of our brains and bodies are heavily impacted by how well we bond and attach to our caregivers. To learn more about this, familiarize yourself with attachment styles, and I suggest the work of Jessica Fern and Alice Miller. Anxiety. Our stress response for uncertainty around potential threat in and of itself is not a disorder, but a beneficial instinct. Anxiety becomes a disorder when it impairs the body's ability to function at its most curative potential. It is vital to understand that chronic stressors alter the body in several unfavorable ways. We'll get into some of these later. How the human body forms itself and wires itself to best adapt to its present environment in a nutshell. A human body forms itself based on the DNA passed down from the mother and the father. The organism follows a combination of these two genetic blueprints to weave its brain and body into existence. This process is incredibly rapid, making over 1 million new connections within the brain each second in the early stages. The connections being made are based on the two models passed down from their parents, as well as input from the environment. Changes are being made from the combination of mom and dad's stress response and mom and dad's rest response, and those pathways are being altered to best fit the current circumstances. How the functionality of the infant's body chooses what traits and patterns to develop and which ones to delete happens by a process of genesis and atrophy. So, massive amounts of connections are made throughout this nervous network, and any that see reuse are strengthened. Those that don't seem necessary are left to break down and make space and resource for other connections in the future. What this means is anytime something happens, again, over 1 million connections are being made per second, the infant is unconsciously changing how its body functions to better cope with or thrive within whatever the event is. So if an infant is held and loved, every second of being held and loved is making hundreds of thousands of connections to best operate in a safe environment. This is in terms of all bodily functions, hormone balance, creating sight and smell, growth, everything. So each second an infant feels securely attached to a caregiver, it is rapidly developing its rest response, which is responsible for the curative functions of the body, since in those moments there is no need for threat instincts to be engaged. But of course this means that if an infant is hurt by a human, it is engaging that threat response even though it's not capable of fighting or fleeing. So, in that instance, every second of an infant being hurt by a human weaves distrust of others, a response to unsafe environments, a feeling of unprotected isolation, a need for more stress hormone production, and many other factors into the functionality of its entire body. So not only is this woven into how the infant will experience and navigate the world, some of those curative processes will be temporarily suspended and neglected. Some of their pathways even atrophied, as hypervigilance seems to the body to be of greater concern and a more necessary strategy than rest. This is a feature of evolution, to be adaptable on a genetic level in less than one generation's time. So it's a misnomer to consider traumatizing an infant as brain damage, but it does drastically impair the infant's ability to develop a healthy, securely attached, balanced, and easily regulated nervous system. So, though trauma itself isn't overt damage, it is harmful to the healthy function of the body. Ways chronic stress impacts development in a nutshell. As a result of chronic stress, the body operates more from its threat response than its rest response in terms of the ideal healthy balance, which means it is primed to neglect certain functions of the parasympathetic nervous system, functions like creating neural pathways, creating antibodies and scanning the body for illness, extracting nutrients from and digesting food, healing, the repair and modeling of bone tissue, preparing growth hormones, and more are all discussed in Robert Sapolsky's Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. The threat response is a feature of evolution, because if you're in danger, you don't need to model your bones, scan for illness, or digest food. You need to survive the dire situation. And that feature, the threat response, is great for allocating all of your energy to surviving a state of emergency. That's adaptive. It becomes maladaptive when all of those curative functions are shut off and adrenaline floods your idle body as you look at overwhelming emails or worry about paying the rent. And it is in this psychological realm where we can stress to the point of hypervigilance, signaling our body to react to a state of emergency when the body is not directly endangered. Even in utero, the body is rapidly building itself and adapting to the stress levels of the mother. Two quick examples of how rapid this epigenetic shift can be. One, Luann Brizendine mentions studies of people in their adulthood who were born during wartime versus people the same age who weren't. And those who were gestating in immense stress were far more likely to have heart disease, cancer, ulcers, diabetes, etc. 2. Michael Moss, in his book Hooked, gives an example of a region affected by famine. In that region, babies born during the famine were far more efficient at storing fat, to the point that obesity was an issue when the famine ended. So, if we know chronic stressors and recurring stressors are detrimental to the development of the brain and body, we must ask an important question. What chronic and recurring stressors are directly and indirectly associated with poverty? Food insecurity and malnutrition. Housing insecurity, which can also take the form of homelessness or needing to stay in abusive relationships to afford rent, even proximity to crime. We will address how crime is largely a byproduct of poverty, as well as lead poison and other industrial toxins being present in and around the home due to redlining. It should be mentioned that the CDC, as of 2016, stated that any detectable amount of lead in the body is damaging to the brain. Healthcare insecurity. The psychological torment of parents knowing a trip to the emergency room would financially ruin them, like any such stressor, manifests in harmful ways within the physical body and its ability to function to its potential. Which is a terrible feedback loop, because if the worry about needing to go to a hospital is depleting the creation of antibodies, the body is more prone to illness and therefore more likely to need a hospital. The paywall denying access to therapy. This means the person doesn't have a professional to help them understand their psychological stress, and they are not taught by such a professional how to deal with the stress, which increases the likelihood of using substances to soothe dysregulation. For how stress and trauma influence substance abuse, I strongly suggest the work of Gabor. It's also important to note that these economic stresses come with a few of their own, like needing to stay in abusive workplaces in order to pay bills, or resorting to debt traps like cash advance loans out of desperation, which of course have predatory interest rates, forcing the cycle to continue. These factors are how poverty is a forced state of physiological disrepair, and the epigenetics effect of poverty get passed on, meaning the hypervigilant adaptation to stressful environments becomes a part of the genetic blueprint for the next 3 generations or more. See Mark Wolin's work to learn more about intergenerational trauma. Persistently stressful environments like poverty trigger dormant responses in the DNA and changes the functionality of the body to live more in its threat response, which of course becomes relevant evolutionary information that is passed down to the next generation. Understanding the trap. Government assistance is available to a portion of the impoverished class. Though assistance is good, it's important to see how it's difficult for any person to financially progress beyond their need of that assistance. Because a person must make less than a certain amount to receive these benefits, they are often unable to take promotions that would end government assistance in housing and medication. Because the only financially responsible way to accept a higher paying job is if the increase in pay matches the value of the assistance they are utilizing. Many impoverished parents need to claim dependents in order to get insurance for needed health care, meaning those children in their adolescence cannot accept promotions or decent jobs without it meaning that a parent loses access to needed medication. There's also a misconception that people who receive assistance are abusing the system to live without having to work. But we can debunk this very quickly with one example from a multi-billion-dollar corporation paying poverty wages to its base-level employees. In 2014, taxpayers spent $6.2 billion toward government assistance for people employed by Walmart, according to Forbes. In that same year, the company made over $118 billion in gross profits. So why isn't a corporation that makes $118 billion in profits the entity that is responsible for making sure its employees aren't impoverished? Wouldn't it make sense for the massive successful corporation to pay their workers so the citizens don't have to? Why is it the responsibility of the taxpayers to complete the income of employed workers. I know it's low-hanging fruit to address Walmart as an example of this, but make no mistake, it is not the only wildly successful U.S. company that pays its employees below the poverty line. As for how attachment alters the ways genes build the body, we have to discuss the difference between secure and insecure attachment. Secure attachment is an infant's bond to their caregivers, wherein that bond it is known on a visceral level that the body is safe and loved. This means the infant has a sense of belonging to the tribe far more than a sense of needing to cope independently. Insecure attachment, though it manifests in different traits and coping strategies, is when the bond with caregivers is not a guarantee of love and safety. This means the infant feels abandoned on a visceral level, and the genes express to fit this emotion. The anxiety of not knowing if they are cared for makes the child hypersensitive to the approval of others. For if they can sense the approval and disapproval of the tribe, they can alter behavior to be less rejected and more accepted. This is not a conscious strategy or choice made by the infant. This is an unconscious instinctual process chosen by the genes because those genes were triggered into adapting to the threat of not being loved. This feeling of uncertainty regarding one's belonging to the tribe is a chronic stressor. At its most base sense, may be the concept most worthy of being described as trauma, because it is laying the groundwork for how the body functions and how well it attaches to others throughout the course of that child's life. To explain why this is, imagine a child has two good adoring parents and is well nurtured for 20 years. Then, while walking, they are robbed at knife point. Though being robbed is a traumatic experience and will cause the genes to express differently going forward, that person has 20 years of positive connective instincts, knowing that other people are good and nurturing. This means they have lived with less of a feeling of isolation, which John Cassiopo's work illustrates as a taxing residual stressor. So, though we know the overt violence is a capital T trauma, the person in this example can likely work through the changes the body made toward hypervigilance in a matter of years, because the groundwork for feeling safety and belonging has been laid within their brains over thousands of thoughts and experiences. It's difficult to illustrate why attachment wounds are a capital T trauma, especially because our rational minds understand the silly misinterpretations of a toddler. For example, say I'm a person with abandonment issues at age 20. I can logically know, in retrospect, that dad left home every day to go to work, and him leaving the house had nothing to do with not loving me or wanting to abandon me. But unfortunately, as a toddler who doesn't have an adult rational mind, that interpretation of dad doesn't love me and abandons me, despite being wholly incorrect, has changed the physiology of how trusting and safe my adult body feels, potentially for the rest of my life. And that feeling of disconnection as a result of the trauma is far more difficult to correct course because it's been wiring into my brain and nervous system as a result of thousands of thoughts and experiences. To exemplify how profoundly attachment alters function, imagine an infant is crying for the affection of their mother, but the mother wants the baby to learn to sleep alone. If the baby cries for 1 hour before falling asleep, we take the rate of neurogenesis, 1 million neural connections per second, multiply that number by 60, since there are 60 seconds in a minute, and multiply that by 60 since there are 60 minutes in an hour, we get 3,600,000,000 connections forming in the brain that are epigenetically leaning toward overdeveloping the threat response because the infant feels unloved, alone, and therefore unsafe within its environment. The reason it's so important to mention attachment wounds in the context of poverty is because of how many women in poverty cannot afford to take time off for maternity leave. Gabor Mate mentions that nearly 25% of women across the United States are back to work within 2 weeks of giving birth. If we truly look at the science of how rapidly the brain and body develops, just in terms of biology and the benefits of forming secure attachments, maternity leave should be no less than 3 years. This issue means that nearly 25% of infants born within our economic culture are denied the possibility to establish secure attachments to their mothers, and therefore are pushed into biological changes that prepare their bodies for hypervigilance and to neglect those key healing functions of the parasympathetic nervous system that we discussed earlier. We cannot talk about attachment wounds in redlined areas without mentioning how our legal system enforces laws by tearing family members out of the homes for crimes, many of those crimes being nonviolent. Incarcerating a parent for a nonviolent crime punishes the developing nervous system of their children far more than it keeps society safe from illegal behavior. It's important to know that roughly 10% of the incarcerated population are there because they could not pay certain fines or could not afford bail and are held in prison. We'll get deeper into this later. I would venture that alienating children from their adult supporters will in time increase crime because the less safe someone feels as they grow, the more necessary it is for their body to adapt to a sense that the world is a hostile environment, meaning the physiology changes to favor that hypervigilance over proper healthy rest. Another way to put this is abduction and the revocation of one's self-ownership is far more violent to that individual and their direct community than any victimless crime they committed. I understand the conversation changes when we speak of violent offenses because violent crimes traumatize others, and there is a responsibility of any society to protect people from violent acts. My point is, if our society has this responsibility to protect people from violent acts, absolutely no one should respect the incarceration for profit model of the United States. If you aren't familiar with privatized prisons and the cheap labor exploits of prisoners in this country, I suggest the work of Fritzi Horstman. It is vital to note that the owners and investors of these businesses essentially lobby to change laws to incarcerate more people even if crime is in decline. And I'd like to point out that, according to study, there are more prisons than colleges in 36 of the 50 states. This article is linked in the description. I understand there will be pushback on this from many. A question will arise: why should we feel compassion for criminals? Didn't they waste their chance to live freely? And though I hear this, if the vast majority of all prisoners come from the impoverished class, if living within that class is literally living in violence, did they ever have a fair chance to waste? If these individuals had to moonlight as drug dealers to meet the basic needs of their families, if they never had access to therapy, or if every medical emergency in their family wiped out whatever savings the family managed to accrue, did they really have a valid legal option within poverty? I, like you, don't fancy the idea of someone breaking into the home and stealing all of my valuables. But that is a gain resources crime. If resources like food, housing, medication, and even intangibles like education were freely accessible to all, wouldn't the rate of every gain resources crime plummet? Is it fair to say that if a person has resources, they will be less inclined to steal them? I can see the next part of the argument arising as well. A criminal still chose to commit the crime. If someone uses their liberty to break laws, is that not a display of moral irresponsibility? To this I say, there's a myth of liberty within capitalism. When the system is built upon people needing to live paycheck to paycheck, laborers don't have liberty. They are either wage slaves or debt cattle. If those who own the means of production pay them to produce, and the payment goes to their housing expenses, a laborer can gain nothing. They are financially dependent on property owners to appease property owners to have a place to live. To opt out of the workforce would be choosing destitution and malnutrition over economic abuse, which is no real option at all. Rather, it's an ultimatum from a system that withholds human rights to force enough desperation to coerce hundreds of thousands of people into choosing, in loose quotes, exploitation over crime or death. So if someone has a moral responsibility to behave with dignity, what of situations like this, poverty in the US, where all three options deprive an individual of their dignity? And when we consider this, must we acknowledge that a dignified life is a privilege with a price tag within capitalism? I can even see the argument arising, well, those aren't the only three options. They can rise to the top of this meritocracy and create a life for themselves outside of poverty. And that's exactly the strategy adopted by millions of inner-city public school kids. So, back to our children in underfunded public schools, growing through adolescence. Their parents were often economically barred from higher education and therefore made careers in low-wage labor. So teens are faced with the dilemma of having been environed in a place that has failed to nurture them, to find a way to reach a level of financial success that will liberate themselves from the ghetto they were born into. Since they have intimately known the struggle and woes of their families and peers, many know that a college degree would be advantageous in attaining financial success. However, many either cannot get financial aid or are unwilling to, as the U.S. model of financial aid is a predatory lending model. So, many born into the segregated labor class have one real option to get into college, which is joining the military. And so kids must sign away their bodies and prep themselves to risk their lives in combat in order to have a chance at a financially secure future. A Squid Game, where the futures of children are held for ransom at the price of risking their lives to take part in the military that is widely known outside its own borders to be an imperialistic one. Then, regardless of their decisions as individuals, in their attempts to escape the trap, they are young adults and are expected to be well-adjusted and financially responsible. If they took out loans to invest in higher education, they are shamed for taking out loans they can't pay back. If they refused to go into debt and tried to work their way up the ladder, they are told they deserve poverty wages for not having gone to college. In addition to this, these adults entering the workforce are treated as if society is a meritocracy and are blamed for not achieving financial success through hard work. But the capitalist economy is based on the property-owning class extracting the value of labor from the working class. Work ethic is not a sustainable way to accrue wealth. Yet regardless of this fact, the culture praises work ethic as the deciding factor in whether or not someone gains financial security. So these young adults are thus blamed for the poverty they were born into as if it was a reflection of their own personal failings, which is obviously an incorrect paradigm. For every single reason I've addressed so far, the United States is not a meritocracy. God, that's satisfying to say. But back to our dilemma with dealing with crime. Let's shift our gaze at prison and the importance of higher education as well as access to therapeutic services to a focus on violent offenders. James Gilligan brought to my attention that in Massachusetts there was a program to educate prisoners. Let's mention first that the ordinary rate of reoffense is 71% within 5 years after a prisoner is released from prison, according to the Department of Justice. Less than 1% of prisoners who gained a college degree while incarcerated were reoffenders after release over a 30-year period leading up to the program being dismantled for incentivizing crime, loose quotes, despite having clearly reduced it. Additionally, James Gilligan took part in a 1-year prison reform experiment in San Francisco, exclusively with violent offenders, where the inmates had access to psychotherapy, education, safe conversations with victims of violent crimes, theater, and various arts. There were programs available 6 days a week for 12 hours a day. When those inmates were released, their rate of reoffending was down 83% compared to the average. This speaks volumes about the effects of art and community in terms of nervous system regulation and the positive impact on human physiology as a result. If we can trust access to therapies to reduce violence among adults who committed violent crimes, imagine what access to therapies could do for children in their most formative years, the years of their development where neurogenesis is most rapid, when the nervous system is building itself to have behavioral inclinations for the rest of their life. This is as good a segue as any to discuss how law works against the impoverished, starting with the ideology of law and what it means for generating a sense of safety or threat. The idea of government authority is the idea that the state is justified to revoke the autonomy of its citizens, ideally for a greater good. We know this because all law is enforced using duress, as in comply with the will of the state or violent force will be used. So, in Western civilization, the very concept of authority implies both violence and the deprivation of one's self-ownership. The relevance of this, in terms of biology, is the suppression of agency. With it is a sense of threat inherent to experiencing life in a non-consent society, gearing the nervous system toward hypervigilance and away from rest, again impairing the healthy autonomic functions of the human body. We'll get into why capitalism is always a non-consent societal model later. One might argue against this, stating that most people operate under the ideology that law exists to protect them, that the capacity for the state to use violence is done to stop dangerous people from causing harm. And if this is the position of the majority of our culture, then it leans toward being a relief of stress and therefore is beneficial to the nervous system. However, in both of these ideologies, either if law is against us or law is for us, there exist dangerous people who can cause us harm. Perhaps either are equally impactful, or perhaps they're not. It's very hard to say for certain. But what we do know for certain is that structural violence causes more death than behavioral violence, meaning individuals, even bad actors, are not as much of a concern to address, since the function of law is to maintain the structures of the society. This means that if law is protecting structures that impede people from meeting needs, law itself is a detriment to society. Another way to phrase this is, if the order being sustained by law is actively damaging people who live under it, sustaining order is an act of violence against those who are abused and neglected by the structures in place. According to the World Health Organization, more deaths are caused by economic inequality than all forms of behavioral violence combined. When James Gilligan addresses structural violence, he very clearly draws the lines of the increased death rates among the poor compared to the wealthy within societies that divide its people into the rich and the poor. He goes on to say that poverty kills more people than all murders, suicides, and wars combined. If this is true, the people who demand better conditions for every citizen find themselves colliding with authority, which historically is a thinly veiled euphemism for the capability to use violence against less capable people. Maybe you don't believe this system falls into the category of an unjust one. But what I want you to acknowledge is that it is possible for law and order of a country to be exploitative of its people. And in those situations, the gatekeepers of economic privilege are the police and the militarized violence they represent. Though it's cherry-picking a part of history to illustrate how classist law can be, the formation of the NYPD is a great example of the law being used to separate laborers from human rights. A thorough article about this will be in the description. To best showcase how the justice system is a barrier between the impoverished class and any economically secure class, we need to mention laws punishable by fine. Illegal and punishable by fine means legal for the wealthy class. So classes live under different laws, therefore different levels of threat. Thus, different epigenetic triggers changing the course of their physiology. Tara O'Neill Hayes and Margaret Barnhorst, in an article titled Incarceration and Poverty in the United States, illustrate this glaring issue well. I quote with ellipses. Another significant share of the incarcerated population consists of individuals who have been arrested for a failure to pay debts or fines owed for minor infractions. Many legal infractions are punished through the imposition of fines. Courts also require defendants, guilty or not, to pay fees for a myriad necessary services, such as court clerk fees, filing fees, DNA database fees, jury fees, crime lab fees, and late fees. 43 states require defendants to pay for their court-appointed lawyer, sometimes even when the accused is found not guilty. At least 41 states charge room and board for time in prison, and every state, excluding Washington, D.C., requires wearers of home monitoring devices to pay for their use. Failure to pay these fines, or rather, failure to comply with a court order, can result in imprisonment, despite the fact that imprisoning an individual for inability to pay has been ruled unconstitutional. Nearly half of local governments now receive more than 20% of their revenue through the imposition of fines and court costs. In 2010, 10 million people across the United States owed a collective $50 billion in fees, fines, and charges to the criminal justice system. It is unknown how many of these individuals are being imprisoned for their debts. While the populations arrested for activities indirectly relating to poverty, homelessness, inability to pay child support, and non-payment of debts and fines are harder to quantify, it is clear they represent a significant share of the incarcerated population, possibly up to 10%. These estimates show that nonviolent drug offenders and people arrested or held indirectly for their poverty account for nearly half of the incarcerated population in the United States. End quote. It's important to note that the United States has an absurdly high incarcerated population compared to the rest of the world. Look at this graph on the screen from Prison Policy Initiative. When it comes to navigating crime, we cannot uninvent guns. We cannot uninvent fentanyl. The only thing we can do to prevent their contribution to the death rates is to create a society so nurturing, supportive, inclusive, and dignified that people feel no need to use these nightmares we've invented. And if we can step away from them for a few generations, perhaps these toxic and lethal things will be seen as ancient relics from a more primitive time. We want our citizens to be raised on love and support, not raised on a fight for survival. Isn't that the point of civilization? To not live in a dog-eat-dog wild jungle? Survival of the fittest individual is a failed paradigm. Children do not need to be traumatized to toughen up. There's an African proverb, The child banished from the village will burn it down to feel its warmth. There is a consistent rise in mass shootings in our country. In the past 10 years, there have been 82 mass shootings in the U.S. In the 10 years prior to that, there were 22, according to Statista.com. If these violent tragedies are actions aligned with a worldview about needing to survive a hostile, victimizing world, then we now know that such a worldview will cause more stress hormones to be present in the body even when it's at rest. That the amygdala, the threat radar of the brain, will be hypersensitive to triggers. We know that concussions often result in an underactive prefrontal cortex, and that roughly 25% of death row inmates have had concussive injuries, a stat from Robert Sapolsky. We have to ask, what percentage of crime in the U.S. is a result of our failure as a society to nurture and protect people? What percentage of these crimes would cease to exist if we abolished poverty? As we established earlier, people of color were more likely to be denied home loans and therefore are redlined. Thus, we know that classism and racism are systemically hand in hand. One danger this creates is how easy it is for police to extort the poor, because residential location and non-white skin implies a lack of proper access to legal self-defense, since legal self-defense is very expensive in the United States. It's easy to assume that someone in the projects cannot afford a lawyer, which gives the police an opportunity to break laws and exploit citizens. Not everyone gets access to a public defender, and public defenders are horrendously overworked. The final point, and the crux of this essay, is the feeling of unwelcomeness capitalism creates, especially for those in poverty. How capitalism is always a non-consent society, why that feeling of unwelcomeness, if introduced early enough and if regularly perpetuated, triggers genetic expression to be more competitive, more solitary, and less interdependent. Let's look at the very phrase, earn a living, and dissect what it implies. If you have to earn a living, you are not fundamentally welcome to your own nourishment or protection. The phrase implies that a human being doesn't innately deserve to be alive unless they labor to produce something to be sold. This makes a clear statement to anyone within or near poverty, that you don't belong here. You don't belong at the table of plenty. Hospitals, therapists, vacations, safe neighborhoods, education, these things aren't for you. But if you claw your way to the top of this polluted hill, you will then be acceptable. This sense of severed belonging, on the scale that it exists now, is a trauma our physical human body does not know how to process, because this trauma to this extent is brand new. Since industrialization, in terms of the evolutionary timeline, happened less than a blink of an eye ago. Our bodies, when residually dysregulated, seek attachment as a means to calm the nervous system through co-regulation. The reason we do this is because historically, humans had close-knit tribes where children were raised by a community of parents. We talked about the importance of attachment in brain development. Imagine a child has a dozen parents, and every time that child wants to be held, one of them will hold the infant. It's a great policy in terms of neural development, and that was the average human experience not too long ago. Fast forward to now, we as a species are probably making less eye contact than ever before in human history. And only time and research will prove how damning that may be. I would also venture that the human species is more touch-starved now than it ever has been. To learn more about industrialization's effect on humanity's sense of community, I recommend the work of Johann. Corporate ideology condones the systemic denial of basic needs. It does this in order to force the largest amount of people into a captive market for profit, which means commodifying needs is considered a legitimate business practice. which means an individual's health care, and therefore the health of their body, is not owned by them. It is a product to be sold back to the citizen for a price. No citizen consented to having their health leveraged against them. The same is true for food, housing, etc. This is why capitalism forces the creation of a non-consent society. For example, another way to say food insecurity is a systemic withholding of an essential need from people, which could also be described as making an individual's survival a privilege, not a right. If an individual doesn't own the basic essentials for their body's proper health and nourishment, can it be said that they own their body while living in capitalism at all? A corporatist republic, even one with democratic values, assumes that all members of the society have forfeit their self-ownership and have agreed to do so before they were even born, so that the republic can choose what levels of autonomy to vote away and what levels to give back. Though law likely has its origins in good intentions, there are reasons why it fails to protect and nurture the people. As a quick aside, to further demonstrate why the U.S. is a non-consent society, we can look at the Constitution. It's considered to be a binding contract to all people who are born in the country. But a person cannot, in legal terms, bind someone else to a contract. No other legal contract binds children. No other legal contract tries to bind parties that do not exist yet to obligation. The argument for consent to the Constitution as a contract is that individuals bind themselves by participating in the society, which can't be so because it is not a choice where one is born. The idea that paying taxes is proof of consent is false in the US because it is mandatory, meaning under threat of violence. The idea that voting is consent to the Constitution is false because there exists the possibility that an individual votes for their own self-preservation, and their vote may be an expression of dissent from harmful policies, and obviously, one voting against a policy is not consenting to that policy that they themselves tried to prevent. Furthermore, the individuals who composed the Constitution were white male property owners and were the only people allowed to vote at the time the Constitution was formed. So, even when it was being formed, less than 1/20th of the population were allowed any say in the matter whatsoever, meaning 19 out of 20 people could not have consented to the contract on their own behalf. No Treason, the Constitution of No Authority by Lysander Spooner details these points and more, link in the description. Why is living in a non-consent society such a bad thing for the physical, biological function of the human body? Non-consent is utterly inextricable from every predatory and abusive experience our ancestors have had, which means every individual act, systemic act, or cultural ideology that attempts to deprive someone of agency and autonomy is categorized by the brain as a threat, and aptly so, because no one who wants what's best for our health and happiness would actively weaken or revoke our capability of defending our health and happiness. When I say we know it in our bones that feeling powerless is uncomfortable, it is literal, because powerlessness is dire vulnerability, and there's no greater need for an internal deluge of stress hormones than to urgently reattain influence over the course of one's own future. We need agency. We need influence to feel safe. Without the sense of capability, we are sure to have a dysregulated nervous system. This means, in a country where lobbying is ordinary practice, an entity with money has more of a voice than the poor majority's solidarity in wanting better conditions. Why wouldn't a citizen feel powerless when their representatives vote against their voice? Why wouldn't a citizen feel powerless when a judge overturns a jury's decision? A wealthy person, through buying influence in media, can campaign ideas to a larger audience than an individual without such means, effectively making members of the labor class more silent than the property-owning class. Additionally, if a member of the labor class has brilliant ideas to contribute to society, but must work 2 jobs to provide necessities for their family, that's time and energy that could have gone toward pursuing those ideas. How can someone in the poverty class honestly feel they have a real agency in pulling themselves up by the bootstraps? And why would we expect anyone to pull themselves from unfair treatment into fair treatment within a civilized society? If you disagree with anything I've said here, I want you to understand how recent these sciences are to the culture. Implicit memory is a relatively new concept within the culture. The fact that the breastfeeding bond between mother and infant aids the development of the brain was only a theory in the 1980s. Circumcision having a negative effect on neural development was a wild theory in the 80s. PTSD and its earlier names was not considered a real disorder until 1989, which means the science of traumatology that we know today is younger than I am. Polyvagal theory didn't exist until the 1990s. So, if you disagree with this essay as a result of a paradigm you were introduced to earlier in life, you were likely introduced to that paradigm from someone who did not know better. Please consider what's been said here today. And dear friends across the river, if you've always had healthy food options to eat, if you grew up in a home where the car was fixed when it broke down, where appliances could be replaced the week they died, where you could be taken to the doctor when you were ill, and your pets could be taken to the vet when they were ill, if you had counseling as a child and access to therapy as an adolescent, I need to know that you understand that poverty is literal violence. If you cannot accept this, please tell me why in the comments. I want to bridge this divide. To those of you on this side of the river who couldn't drink the tap because of the metal and bacteria within it, who felt guilty for eating scarce food inside your own kitchen or went to bed hungry, who knew the dark, lamplit rooms for years before the household could afford an electrician to correct the issue. Please, tell me what the most effective and healthy coping mechanisms you found were. I want anyone who wishes to heal from the violence of poverty to be able to scan these comments for personal accounts of healthy ways others have navigated this trauma. And that's it for the essay. Thank you for listening to this. I know it's heavy subject matter. I know it's a hellscape of sorrow and tragedy. I know this because at times, despite my love and fascination with learning the nervous system and the brain, so many times I had to stop learning for 2 weeks and grieve the implications. To hold what could have been in my mind with a profound and wounded sense of longing. It's a lot to take, and here on the internet, you could have chased any experience you wanted. You have a million things more funny or more positive, and you chose to listen. Thank you. This is the shadow work of our society, the willingness to learn uncomfortable things. So we stop telling people how to leave their economic hell, and instead sit with them inside it, and really try to learn what's true, despite the discomfort and horror of those epiphanies. This is part of a trauma recovery project I want to offer people freely. It's called The Art of Nurturing Catharsis. The goal is to make a series of guided healing practices. There's a link to my LibrePay in the description. Any support you can offer is appreciated. If you don't want to use that method and prefer a one-time donation, you can reach out to me. This is the direction I want my life to go. Though I know I'm not the most qualified or the best person for it, I feel drawn to this information, and I keep diving deeper in. Thank you again, and I hope the rest of your day embodies a more joyous mood than this essay has. Have a good one.